Hey, where are you watching from? This isn't my story, but it's one you won't forget. Family secrets can change everything. Some choices leave scars, others bring closure. Let's get into it. 10 years ago, I murdered my grandmother, and I have been celebrating it with my family. Never been good at writing essays, so I'm just going to jump right into it. I am now the only child from my parents, but this wasn't always the case. My dad is a spineless cuck that is dominated by my ruthless mother. When I was around 2 years old and living in Sweden, my dad went on a trip to Syria to visit my grandmother that used to live there, the one I murdered, and stayed with her for 1 year because she had a tumor and had to get a few operations. During this year, he was a regular to a prostitute he fancied. Eventually, he got her pregnant. After giving birth, she came to my grandmother's house and just dumped her daughter on him and left. She ghosted him, and he could not find her anymore. My G-mother called my mother, and all hell broke loose. My mother ordered him to throw my sister in the dumpster and pretend she was not alive because she was filth. My dad was very close to doing this, but somehow what's left of his fatherlyhood woke up for a second, and he didn't throw my sister away. He instead convinced my grandmother to keep her, and eventually she will take care of her when she grew up, technically just having her as a servant. This was the most humane solution he could come up with. When I eventually grew up, I met my sister when I was visiting my G-mother, and we got really close. She even looked a lot like me, so I had no doubt she was my sister. But the way she was living was just awful. It broke my heart seeing how underfed she was. Her clothes were one rip away from being rags, and she was not allowed to use my G-mother's combs and stuff to fix her hair. I would collect any money I got and send it her way, but my G-mother eventually found out and started taking them for herself. She was never allowed to go to school and could only see a doctor when she became seriously ill. By the time she reached 14 years old, she admitted to me that she was thinking about killing herself because she could not see any future for herself. My dad would just marry her to some shit family as soon as my mother died, and she would be more like a commodity to be traded. On 13th of June 2008, my sister had a fight with my grandmother and was holding a little can of gasoline and saying that she was going to burn herself. My G-mother laughed and dared her to do it, which my sister did. My sister lived and died miserably. At first, my parents told me that it was an accident, but I overheard them talking about what happened in detail. By this point, my dad did not even care. I was very disgusted with him and my mother. I dreamed a lot about just jumping on them and biting their fucking throats off and just watch them bleed at horror as I kicked their faces in. I wanted to hold his jaw from the inside with my hands and just rip it from his face. I eventually brooded and started going over the events. 3 guilty people, and I was planning on killing them all. As violently as possible, I could never come up with a plan regarding my parents. But I was already done with how to end my G-mother, the filth who made life miserable for my sister. On December 2008, I booked a ticket to visit my G-mother and was supposed to return before New Year to celebrate with my friends. I told my parents that my friend is picking me up from the airport and I'm going to stay with him for a few days before coming back. I then called my friend and told him that I'm going to bang a girl that I met, and if my parents ever ask him about me, he would have to cover for me. Him being oblivious to what I was actually doing agreed. I flew to Syria, stayed with my G-mother for about 2 weeks, and when the day of my flight came, I packed my bags and told her that I'm going to the airport. With disgust, I kissed her goodbye and then made as much noise as possible with my bags to make sure that the nosy neighbors saw me leave for the airport. I even called a taxi driver that lived nearby, and he took me directly to the airport. I made sure he saw me get into the airport. I then stood at the check-in and took a selfie. I didn't check in. I turned around and walked out. I took a cab to a nearby hotel and dropped my bag off in the room. I changed my clothes and then took a cab back to my G-mother's apartment. It was 2 at night, and I was very quiet when I got up the stairs. I knocked on her door, and she opened when she saw me through the hole. She was surprised to see me and was wondering about the flight. I told her it would delayed for a few hours, so I left the bags at the check-in with the employees. She was tired, so she decided to us some tea while I waited. As soon as she got up, I stood in front of her. She had this very confused look on her face due to my sudden reaction. I had not planned how to exactly do it, but I knew this is as good as it gets. Really quickly, I held her neck with my hands. My thumbs pressed on her throat very hard in case she tried to scream. She instantly got a horrified look on her face, and I just got really angry. She tried to speak but couldn't make a single sound. At first she tried hitting me, but my arms were longer than hers and she could not reach me. When I started applying pressure, she tried to scratch my arms instead. But I was wearing a thick sweater, and also I was being pumped with adrenaline. When I saw her strangling, I became very angry. I was grinding my teeth so hard I almost broke them. I told her this is for my sister. I kept repeating my sister's name in a quiet, angry tone, but she couldn't hear me. She was panicking, and her only concern was getting air. She then kind of just froze there. I kept squeezing even though she didn't move. I really wanted to make sure. I finally let go after a while. My hands were cramped from all that tension and listened for a heartbeat. I sat then on the sofa, took a few breaths, and chalked her again real hard for around 10 minutes. When I was sure she was dead, I started opening every drawer she had until I finally found her golden money. I put them in a small bag and left. I closed the door behind me in case a neighbor found her too early. I walked for maybe a whole hour while my hands were shaking as crazy until I was finally far away. I threw the bag with the money and gold in a small trash bucket that people had in front of their house. I went and took a taxi to the hotel, and I remembered my sister and cried. I remembered my G-mother's face, and I calmed down. I felt complete, like when a daunting task was finally over, a very soothing relief. That night I slept like a fucking baby. I woke up the next morning and brought breakfast and booked a ticket back to Sweden the same day. I turned the TV on and put Ellen some music. For the first time after my sister's death, I was happy. When I came back to Sweden, I took the bus back from the airport and later took the train to my friend's house. Told him that the girl dumped me and I was instead celebrating with him. My dad calls me 2 days later and informs me that my grandmother was robbed and that the thief stole her valuables and killed her when she saw him. No one suspected a fucking thing. I acted surprised and made my way back. For a few months I acted sad and secretly watched my family in case someone got a wild theory. But they all seemed to believe the robbery part since it's not that uncommon. The closest someone got was my uncle when he mentioned how unfortunate it was that I left a day before this and that I could have saved her. My mother called it lucky because I maybe would have also gotten killed. I pretended to be sad about it. Now every year my dad makes a ceremony to kind of remember my mother. They make dinner for family and friends and hope that the prayers reach her. They don't fucking know that this is a time for celebration for me. I am now married and I have 3 kids. The plan of killing my parents is canceled due to them fucking themselves over so bad. It's more of a punishment if they stay alive. They are also not allowed near my children, as a punishment to how they treated my sister. Every year I celebrate this by buying gifts to my wife and kids. My wife wondered why I did this, and I simply said that the way my G-mother passed made me realize how suddenly loved ones can disappear, and how this, my way of saying I love you. This became long enough and I apologize for the many grammatical errors you will find. Edit. Long story short, my dad goes to Syria to care for my G-mother, gets a prostitute pregnant, and gives my half-sister as a servant to my G-mother. Half-sister kills herself at 14, and I travel to Syria and killed my G-mother. Family holds a yearly ceremony where they cook for family and friends, and I celebrate instead. Some things change, some never do. They mourn, I celebrate. Justice or revenge, what's the difference? The past doesn't disappear, no matter how far you run. What would you have done?